I'm Mike.
I'm Sam. Let's get into it.
This time Jackson has a shot. Here comes Adoree Jackson. Adoree Jackson! There goes Adoree! His sixth career return touchdown! And he provides the spark USC needs.
Welcome to episode 18. In today's episode, we're going to do a little bit of a throwback. We're going to look back at the 2014 college or football recruiting class. So we're going to look at the seniors of that year, and we're going to go through the top 10, go through some of their high school career, which caused them to be ranked so highly on the list. We're going to look at their college career, and then we're going to look at their NFL career. Obviously, this is the 2014 list, so their NFL's career is kind of limited. A lot of them only been in the league for 3 years at the maximum, but we're going to see so far who's the best and who had the best college career as well, and kind of see who can excel in the future. And obviously, we're going to be using ESPN's recruiting class for this. I know there's 247; they kind of have a different recruiting class, but we're going to go off ESPN's one for this one. So without further ado, let's go into number 10. The number 10 prospect, we had Quin Blanding, safety, and he decided to attend Virginia. So, Michael, you want to go into a little bit of his high school career?
Yeah, so in high school, he was from Virginia Beach, Virginia, and he ended up having a 90 overall prospect grade, so he was a very elite prospect coming out of Virginia Beach. In high school, he played a lot of positions. He played quarterback on the offensive end, tight end, and wide receiver, but most notably, he was a standout at safety, and he ended up getting a lot of looks, especially in that Virginia area, and that is why he did end up committing to the University of Virginia as a safety.
Yeah, I mean, Virginia's, especially kind of the ACC, it's weaker football, but
yeah,
being able to go to Virginia, he started 12 games right off the bat, so he was a true freshman, which is pretty impressive. But
yeah,
looking at his productivity, his first 2 years, actually his whole career, it was kind of pretty solid. His whole Virginia career.
Yep.
He was the freshman. I believe he was. Let me make sure I have this correct. He was the freshman of the year his first year, and kind of was the leader of the ACC, and kind of the leader of that defense. But later in the NFL, he kind of struggled. He was signed by the Redskins, but he was cut by them, and then he was signed by the Panthers and was cut again. So he's kind of struggling to get his role in the NFL. But I mean, he's still young with his career. But seeing someone that was as productive as he was in college, kind of shocking to see where he's at right now.
Yeah, it's a really interesting case study. Looking at his career, he had 123 tackles as a true freshman, which is absolutely phenomenal. And throughout his college career, he really was a tackling machine. He ended up totaling with 358 career tackles, which puts him 9th in Virginia history. So, I mean, he was a really productive college player, and it's really interesting to see the balance between NFL teams, especially in later rounds. Do they pick for college productivity or do they pick for potential? Quin Blanding isn't an outstanding, wow, eye-popping athlete, so I think that is a reason why he didn't get drafted, but it's still really surprising a player of his caliber in college. I know he did play for a smaller school in terms of prestige for the college football world, but still very surprising that he did go undrafted and he never ended up making an active roster. Like you said, he was cut by the Redskins, but the Panthers ended up picking him up as a practice squad player, and he's been on the practice squad ever since in his short 2-year stint on a practice squad. So it's going to be really interesting to see if he gets an opportunity in the NFL.
Yeah, looking at the stats, I mean, in 2016, he led the ACC in solo tackles. He has the most assisted tackles since 2005. I mean, leading those categories are very important on a football field. And being the safety, you're kind of the safety blanket, quote unquote, safety blanket for the defense and not allowing bigger plays to happen. So seeing him leading the team in tackles and not being on an NFL roster is kind of shocking. Like you said, didn't go to the kind of those blue blood college football school, but I feel like he should have a spot in the NFL right now.
Yeah, most definitely. It's really interesting, and this really makes me think he was the 10th overall rated prospect in the ESPN Top 300 when he was coming out of high school. Obviously, like we said, very productive college player, but all that still didn't matter to NFL teams. He was passed up on of all 32 NFL teams. So it's interesting, and it's kind of a pattern that me and Sam picked up, that it really didn't matter what a player's prestige was coming out of college, or coming out of high school rather. It mattered what you did in college and what you showed in college. But even for Quin Blanding, unfortunately, that wasn't enough to get him drafted.
Yeah. All right. So let's move on to the next one. I think this is kind of more of a notable player. A lot of people are going to know who it is, and that is Adoree Jackson, the 9th prospect. He is from California, and he went to USC. I think that's going to be a trend. That's a trend through this top 5. A lot of the players commit to schools that where they're from. And not a lot of players really travel that far, but you want to go into his high school career?
Yeah, so in high school, he actually grew up in Illinois, outside of Chicago, and his freshman year of high school, he really didn't play too much varsity time on his Illinois high school team. So he ended up moving to California for his sophomore year, and that's where he remained throughout high school. And throughout high school, he was just an incredible athlete, Adoree Jackson was, and he is at the NFL level, as we will get into. He played football, basketball, and he ran track, which is also a pattern that we will see for this top 10, all really amazing track athletes. And in football, he played a lot of positions, but most notably, he was a really standout corner. He also played running back, very good at running back, played wide out, and was a really good return man for his high school team.
Yeah, so kind of that carried over to his college career. Adoree Jackson played offense, defense, and special teams. His freshman year, he won the Pac-12 Freshman of the Year, which kind of like the ACC, the Pac-12 isn't as great as football as like the SEC and Big Ten, but winning the Freshman of the Year shows that you're the best of the best in the whole conference. Kind of his whole career, he's just been all over the field. I think kind of his defense, for his NFL career, he's kind of a solid defensive player, but I think he really shines in kind of the return game and punt return because he's just so quick and he has great agility. But I mean, at USC, he won a lot of awards in 2016. That's probably his best year, 2016. He was a consensus All-American. He won the Jim Thorpe Award for best cornerback or defensive back.
Yeah.
He won the Johnny Rodgers Award, which is the best all-around player, defense, offense, special teams. And then he also, 2016, he won the Defensive Player of the Year for the Pac-12. So just putting all those awards together in his career, he was able to be the 18th overall pick for the Tennessee Titans in the 2017 draft.
Yeah, like you said, he was just an outstanding return man at USC. In his freshman year bowl game, he ended up having a 98-yard return touchdown, and he also had a 71-yard touchdown. So, I mean, really fast, really good in the open field. He also in college, he was a standout track runner. I mean, winning multiple awards. He was a really good jumper too. Like you said, with that speed, he ran a 4.42 40 at the combine, and he's been pretty solid in his NFL career so far. In his rookie year, he ended up with 3 forced fumbles and 70 tackles, along with 17 pass deflections. So out of a rookie back, that's really all you can ask for a secondary player. And in his second year, he had 2 picks along with 73 tackles, and the Titans ended up picking up his 5th-year option. So the Titans certainly think he was worth that first-round draft pick.
Yeah, I think kind of something that really notable for Adoree Jackson in the NFL, kind of when he was a rookie and picked by the Titans, they had a missing spot for him on the roster. I mean, in the cornerback position, so he was able to start right away as a rookie, which is kind of, I mean, we talked about quarterbacks sitting or starting, but I feel like any other position getting put right into the starting spot is kind of more beneficial because you're going to need those growing pains. I know.
Yeah.
I mean, NFL, at quarterback, you can learn behind the starter, but just getting the actual playing time, like at a position with cornerback, with catching up to the NFL speed and learning the NFL like offenses and defenses really help him. I mean, he still has a young career. It's only 3 seasons in, but I can see him being a Pro Bowler in the future and really making an impact with this Titans defense.
Yeah, most certainly. I think he's definitely above average cornerback. If Adoree Jackson is your second best cornerback on your team, you're in a really good spot. And if he's the first best cornerback on your team and you have a solid cornerback room, I mean, you're still in a pretty good position. That's the type of player that Adoree Jackson has been in his career so far. Like you said, he came out of USC, so in the Pac-12, he's not used to playing these great NFL caliber wide receivers. So he didn't even show that much growing pains considering that. So he's been a really good NFL player so far, in my opinion. And he's been really worthy of that 9th spot in this recruiting class and certainly that 17th spot in the draft.
Yeah. All right. So moving on to number 8, another cornerback. So you see the difference. It's night and day with number 9, Adoree Jackson being a pretty solid NFL player. And then you have number 8, Tony Brown. So he committed to Alabama and not much going on with him, honestly. You want to go into his high school career a little bit?
Yeah, so he was a standout corner starting in his sophomore year. He started as a varsity player from his sophomore year, and he was also one of the best track runners in the nation throughout high school, which really made him an intriguing football prospect because of his world-class athleticism. He was the best track runner out of this top 10, which is really, really big to say because as we will get into and as we already have, there's been some really great track runners and just track players in general coming out of this draft class. So at the 2014 Under Armour game, like a lot of these players as well, he announced his commitment to Alabama.
Yeah, and then, I mean, looking at his college stats, you would think being the number 8 prospect, I mean, okay, fine, maybe his freshman year, he's not going to play that many games. They just want to kind of lower him in. But then, I mean, his sophomore, junior, and senior year, he played the majority of the season, and he never got over 15 or never got over like 25 tackles.
Yeah.
Solo tackles, I mean, he had 30 solo tackles total his whole career. I mean, he only had 3 interceptions his whole career at Alabama. You're supposed to, when you're an Alabama defensive player, you're supposed to be the cream of the crop, and he just did not put any great numbers up. I mean, he was arrested a couple of times in Tuscaloosa. He was suspended for fighting before a bowl game. So
yeah.
You have someone who has all the talent in the world, ranked 8 in the whole country, and just kind of just a flop.
Yeah, right after his freshman year in Alabama, after really not playing at all, being kind of a red shirt, he got arrested at the end of that year, which was not good. And he did, like you said, he started a fight before the 2015 Cotton Bowl game. And in 2018, he was still, despite all this, being a notable player in his recruiting class coming from Alabama, he still did earn a scouting combine invite. And he ended up running a 4.35 40, which for a lot of teams, even if a player isn't productive in college, you see Alabama on his transcript and you see a 4.35 40, that usually gets players drafted. But
yeah,
like you said, because he really wasn't productive at all at Alabama, he was still undrafted, and he ended up signing right after the draft with the Chargers, and he was cut before the regular season. And he ended up signing with the Packers in 2018 and was on their active roster for that year, actually. And in 2019, he was on their active roster, which is really good for Tony Brown. A little bounce back for him after a rough collegiate career. And the Bengals, just this offseason, ended up signing him to a 1-year deal going into 2020. So me and Sam will definitely keep an eye on Tony Brown to see if not only he makes the roster, but he ends up playing some solid playing time on that rebuilding Bengals team.
Yeah, you just hope that someone who's ranked that highly coming out of high school and had some issues really just be able to get on track with an NFL roster. I feel like in college you're kind of a lot more lenient. I mean, watching the Aaron Hernandez documentary, kind of talking about how a lot of things he did at Florida were covered up, and you just hope that with an NFL roster, NFL coaching staff that's a lot more accountable for what people do, he'll be able to become a solid NFL player.
Yeah, and it's not the greatest look for ESPN and all the recruiters from ESPN that end up compiling this 300 list to have a cornerback so highly rated and so highly rated over other cornerback prospects that ended up being great NFL players very early on into their career. So we'll get into some of the notable cornerbacks that were positioned in this top 300 after Tony Brown, but certainly he hasn't really lived up to that number 8 spot so far.
So with the number 7 prospect, he's an athlete, so he doesn't really have a position.
Yeah.
I think I was going to talk about this more about his high school. He kind of played all over the field in high school, but we have Speedy Noil. He's from New Orleans, and he committed to Texas A&M. So he's the second player in this top 10 that commit to Texas A&M. We're going to talk about Myles Garrett later in the video. But you want to talk about his high school career?
Yeah, if you want a lot of information on him, a YouTuber by the name of Flemlo Raps actually made a really good video on Speedy, so check that out if you want more information on him. But coming out of high school, he played a lot of positions, like you said. He played wide receiver, he played running back, he played defensive back, he played safety, but most notably, again, he was a wide receiver where he was recruited by many top schools in the nation, and he actually ended up committing to Texas A&M, and Texas A&M had a very good recruiting class in 2014. So he was another player, a top 10 guy who Texas A&M ended up reeling in, which is really impressive, but he really never ended up playing too much at Texas A&M because of legal trouble.
Yeah. So looking at his stats, I mean, his freshman year, he had 500 yards, which is pretty good for a freshman, kind of getting acclimated to the offense. But he took every year. He only played 3 years, so he left after his junior year. But he got worse, kind of progressively worse each year. And Flemlo kind of alluded to this, how Christian Kirk came in and kind of just took some of the productivity away because Christian Kirk is seeming to be the better athlete. I mean,
yep.
Speedy did have injuries and problems with the law, so that kind of hurt him being ranked on the roster, but he just didn't really get his opportunity because better talent came.
Yeah, I mean, Speedy, he went undrafted, and he never even ended up making an NFL team. He ended up going to the Canadian Football League, and he was picked up by the Eskimos, but he was pretty quickly released by them as well. And he ended up trying out for San Antonio's AAF team, American Football Alliance team, which ended up folding pretty early on into their berth. But he didn't even end up making that league. So when I see a player who was the 7th ranked prospect in their class, he tries to go to the NFL, doesn't make the NFL, tries to go to the CFL, doesn't make the CFL, and then doesn't even make an AAF league that folded after 6 or 7 games. I mean, that really tells me, and with all of his legal trouble, he was arrested for marijuana possession, failure to pay bond, fleeing arrest, criminal trespassing, and an invalid driver's license, just to name a few of his arrests. After looking at all of that, that really makes me believe that he's never going to ever play football again at a high level. I know he actually ended up going back to college to get a degree, which is great because I think Speedy's football career came to a very abrupt and short end.
Yeah, I mean, I think he kind of saw what was going to happen, and he went back to school to get his degree, and he might just need to be able to kind of go down a different path, unfortunately, even though he is such a gifted athlete.
Certainly.
So with the next recruit in this class, we're going to have Deshaun Han, defensive end, and he committed to Alabama. So he's from Virginia, but he made the journey to Alabama. So obviously, when you think of a top 10 prospect committing to Alabama, you must think he's just otherworldly good. So you want to talk about some of his high school production?
Yeah, he was a 94 overall prospect grade from ESPN coming into his freshman year at Alabama. So he was a very highly rated prospect, as all these guys are. He was a 3-sport athlete in college. He played football, he wrestled, and he did track. And though his high school football team really was not that good, kind of had an even record every single year, never ended up doing anything at the state level, Han really was a standout and an all-state player. And in 2012, he was Rivals.com Football Junior of the Year, and he had 90 scholarship offers by his senior year. So he was very, very well documented in Virginia and in the Virginia football scene to be one of their best players, if not their best player in the state year in and year out for a couple of years when he did go to high school, which is very, very impressive. And like you see out of a lot of players who come out of states where their college football team isn't that great, they'll end up trying to make the jump to a program like Alabama. So that's what Deshaun Han ended up doing, actually.
Yeah, so looking at his college stats, I mean, throughout his 4 years at Alabama, he only had 9 sacks, 30 solo tackles, 41 assisted tackles. I mean, not great production there. I think just someone like him, I mean, his athletic ability might have peaked in high school. So
Yeah.
going to Alabama where you have some athletic freaks who are still growing and still getting stronger, he might have just flatlined or plateaued, and while these other players are getting better and they're able to leapfrog him at Alabama. So even though I'm sure he was in the rotation on defense, like going on third downs or when other players needed rest, but he just was not able to have the amount of production he did in high school.
Yeah, his attention might have been thrown off a little bit at Alabama. He did end up getting a DUI at Alabama in 2017, and like you said, he was never a solidified starter at Alabama, but at his time, even in his true freshman year, he was thrown into the rotation, thrown in against some weaker opponents as we see Alabama faces every year. Alabama's usually a part of many blowouts, so I'm sure Hand got thrown into the mix in those games there. And he ended up actually getting drafted in the 4th round of the 2018 NFL draft by the Lions, which is very interesting to me. It's pretty high for him to get picked in the 4th round, considering he really didn't have any production in college. And he's actually made the active roster for the Lions in both years that he's been playing. But again, he's been injury riddled for both years. So he's going to look to bounce back in the 2020 season, see if he could end up making the roster. But with a bunch of new guys coming in, Da'Shawn Hand's time is going to quickly come to an end if either he gets injured again or he really doesn't perform in training camp and in preseason.
Yeah, he definitely really needs to make the most of this upcoming offseason, this upcoming season, and like he has I think these future 2 years are a very important window for him to kind of become more of an NFL player. So with that, we're going to go into the next prospect. So the number 5 prospect, we had a defensive tackle, from Virginia, and actually attending Virginia, we have Andrew Brown. So the second Virginia player in this top 10 of this class. So you want to go into his high school career?
Yeah, like Da'Shawn Hand, coming from Virginia, he also had a 94 overall prospect grade. So those two guys, both being on the defensive line, they were kind of paired together and pinned together and compared to each other, again, coming out of the same state. And he actually ended up playing for 2 different high schools, both in Virginia, and he really was just an absolute standout. And in his junior year, he was a first-team All-American. So not only was he All-State, he was All-American, which is very, very rare for a junior in high school to do. And in his senior season, he did even better than his junior season, if that is even believable. And he increased his sack and tackle totals, which made him a repeat first-team All-American and the Gatorade High School Player of the Year in 2013. So Andrew Brown was a very, very decorated high school player, and after his senior year, he did end up committing to Virginia.
Yeah, and then looking at his college stats, so his freshman sophomore year as a D tackle, and then junior and senior year he was switched to defensive end. But at defensive tackle his first year, he was only able to get 10 for 2-year schedule. He only got 10 total tackles.
Yeah.
And 1 sack. So that is just being the number 6 prospect. That is just pretty terrible. 5, excuse me. That is terrible. So then, moving him to defensive end, that did help him a considerable amount. He was able to get 38 total tackles his junior year and then 46 total tackles his senior year. So, I think he is kind of undersized. He's 6'4", under 300 pounds. So kind of be able to put him to the defensive end, which is kind of a smaller frame type position. I don't think he had the mass on him to be a D tackle. So you were able to see this production increase when he switched positions, and he was even invited to the Senior Bowl his senior year.
Yeah, I think Andrew Brown's a classic example of a high school football player, especially on the defensive line. We see this a lot in high school football. Somebody who's so much bigger, faster, and stronger than everybody. He just kind of plays bully ball. He doesn't have to learn too many techniques. He can just kind of bull rush right through the offensive line and really get outstanding numbers, which he really did in high school. But again, possibly like Da'Shawn Hand, kind of peaked in high school. He ended up getting drafted in the 5th round, actually, by the Bengals, but he's never made their active roster. He's been on their preseason roster and practice squad every single year since then.
Yeah, that's a great point you made up. I think, yeah, just being just bigger and stronger than all the high school competition, he was able to be so great. That's why he got the recruiting rank that he actually did. So moving on, so this is a really big name, one of the best defensive ends in the NFL right now. We have Myles Garrett at number 4. So he was a 5-star recruit when he attended Texas A&M, which is, I believe, the best recruit Texas A&M has ever landed, like as in highest ranked.
Yes.
Obviously, you can go into his high school career, but
yeah, along with being the highest recruit that Texas A&M has ever gotten, he ended up being the highest overall draft pick that Texas A&M ever produced. So we'll get into that a little bit later. But in high school, Myles Garrett was an absolute beast, as we've seen at every single level. He was a letterman in football, basketball, and track. And in his senior year of high school, he had 19.5 sacks, which is very, very impressive at the high school level. And he, like you said, highest rated prospect for Texas A&M ever. And as a true freshman, I mean, he was an absolute animal. He broke Texas A&M's freshman sack record, and he was in also the SEC freshman sack record. And he, at Texas A&M as a freshman, he was an All-American in all SEC while playing half the season with a torn ligament in his hand, which is just so impressive.
Yeah, I mean, he would have 81 solo tackles. He had 31 sacks in only 3 years, so 11 his freshman year, and that, like you said, that was a record. And he was a consensus All-American in 2016. And 2016, his junior year, that was probably his best year. I mean, he only played 10 games, but having 8.5 sacks in 10 games, and if he had 3 more games, who knows what that number would have been. But obviously, moving on, he got picked to first overall by the Cleveland Browns, and he's had a great NFL career, but a lot of injuries, and this recent year he's kind of had some problems with the NFL rules. Obviously, the big Mason Rudolph thing, but before the Mason Rudolph fiasco, he got fined for multiple unnecessary roughness penalties, but definitely a difference maker with his skill-wise, but definitely his character on the field might be an issue, but off the field he seems like a great guy.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, he was reinstated actually just a couple months ago, and his punishment for this next upcoming season is still unknown. I would assume he's going to miss about half the year, honestly. I think he's going to miss 6 to 8 games. I'm sure he's going to appeal that ruling, but I don't think we're going to see Myles Garrett week 1 in the NFL season. And Myles Garrett is going to go down in NFL history, whether he likes it or not, of being the longest suspension for a single in-game incident in NFL history. And I'm not sure anybody else is ever going to match what he did on the football field to Mason Rudolph that day.
Yeah, but I mean, that was just a terrible act. I mean, he could have seriously injured Mason Rudolph, but looking past that, I mean, he has great stats. In 2018, he was a Pro Bowler. He had 13.5 sacks, 35 solo tackles, 9 assist tackles. So he's a game changer. And coming to the NFL, he was a lot more refined than someone like Chase Young, I feel like, or even maybe Nick Bosa or Joey Bosa. He's a really great generational talent here.
Yeah, I mean, he was ranked in his first full season. He was 49th on the NFL Top 100 list. So, I mean, that really tells you what not only the public thinks about Myles Garrett in terms of how great he is, but the NFL players and how great they all acknowledge that he is, because remember that NFL list is always voted on by the players. But I mean, just such an absolute athletic freak. I mean, that's what made him the first overall pick. Not only did he display that at Texas A&M, but at the scouting combine. I remember it was one of the greatest scouting combines from an individual player ever. He ran a 4.64 40-yard dash time, and weighing 272 pounds and standing at 6'4". I mean, that's blazing fast speed at the 40-yard dash time. He has such a great bend and just speed and first step around the corner, and it just makes him almost unblockable. He also has a 41-inch vertical, I'm sorry, which is just absolutely outstanding. And he ended up benching 225 reps or 225 pounds 33 times. So, I mean, across the board, he's just very athletic.
Yeah, I just think to have a successful NFL career, I think he really needs to kind of fix his on-the-field antics, because he can be the anchor on that Browns defense for a very long time, and they've made key acquisitions these recent years, so he can be the star in that defense and leader on the defense when they make playoff runs, hopefully in the future.
Yeah, I mean, he's certainly a reason that the Cleveland Browns had such a hype train around them going into the season, and he certainly is a big reason why that hype train came to a screeching halt, and the Browns really ended up not doing anything this season. So, I mean, the Browns defense really starts and stops with Myles Garrett and how great he is.
Yeah. So moving on to the number 3 prospect, we have offensive tackle Cameron Robinson. So he's out of Louisiana, and he committed to Alabama. So another Alabama commit in this top 10. So you want to go into his high school career?
Yeah, so he's another player. So the top 4 players in this draft class that we're going to get into, Myles Garrett and then Cameron Robinson at number 3. We'll talk about the 2 and 1 pretty soon on, but they've all had a 95 overall prospect grade. So this is a really high prospect grade. And if you're a 95 overall prospect grade, not only are you expected to be really, really good at the collegiate level, but really, really good at the pro level. So in high school, he was a 2-time All-State player, and he was an All-American his senior year. And Cameron Robinson had so many offers across the entire nation. Almost every single school in the nation offered him a scholarship, and like a lot of players, if they get offered by every single school, they're going to pick Alabama, even though he is pretty close to where LSU is.
Yeah, I mean, being on Alabama, they're known for their beefy offensive line and their great running game. I mean, before Tua came into play, they were known as like a ground and pound offense. So Cameron Robinson, his time in Alabama, he was an anchor on the offensive line. I think he only surrendered 3 sacks in 1 year, and he really helped the Alabama offense make those deep playoff runs, and I think he won 2 national championships at his time at Alabama. So you see he didn't really, obviously he's an offensive lineman, so he's not going to be a lot of name recognition, but he's able to be really an anchor on the offensive line, and with that he was able to be picked in the 2nd round by the Jaguars.
Yeah, he ended up being a really, really important player for Alabama. It's really rare that you see an offensive tackle, a left tackle specifically, the blind side to the quarterback, of course, before Tua came, to be a freshman starting. Like you said, he only gave up 3 sacks his freshman year, which allowed him to be a freshman All-American. And he ended up playing really, really great playing time for a great Alabama team for all 3 of the years that he was at Alabama. But in the NFL, he's been, I think, an average NFL tackle starter. I mean, he tore his ACL and missed all of 2018, and he bounced back to have a decent year protecting Nick Foles and Gardner Minshew in 2019. And he's currently, right now, I just checked, the 2nd left tackle on the Jags depth chart. So he's going to have to fight his way back to the starting position. But, I mean, he's a player who he still is very young, and he has a lot of potential down in Jacksonville.
Yeah, I mean, with injuries, and he's had some problems with the law, like some other players on this list. So hopefully he can kind of get on the right track and be an anchor for that offensive line for the Jaguars in the future. I mean, he'll be blocking for the number 1 recruit that we're talking about later in the future as well. So going to number 2, we have Jabrill Peppers. So on ESPN's top 300, he was listed as a cornerback, but obviously during his time at Michigan, he kind of changed from defensive back to, even Pro Football Reference had him ranked as a linebacker, or listed as a linebacker his senior year. So he's kind of an all over the place for defense. And similar to Adoree Jackson, he did play some offense, and he did have some kick returning and punt returning as well.
Yeah, Jabrill Peppers, I mean, in the 2010s, I believe, in my opinion, he's one of the most exciting high school defensive players and college defensive players we've actually seen. I mean, he is just off the charts with his athleticism in high school. I mean, this really attests to how great he was in high school. He attended 2 different high schools throughout his young career, and he won 4 straight state championships in his high school days. So it didn't matter which high school team he went to, he was winning the state championship for that team. I mean, he was a running back and starting in his sophomore year, and he's been a cornerback since his freshman year. And he ended up transferring to that second high school, like I just said, after his sophomore season. So his first 2 years was a great player, ended up winning the national championship twice, or the state championship, I should say, and then ended up doing so with his other high school team his last 2 years. I mean, and he was also a standout track runner, setting records in New Jersey, and he ended up committing to Michigan after his senior season.
Yeah, so his freshman year he was injured, so he only played 3 games. So with his 3 games, he was allowed to become a redshirt player. So then his sophomore and junior year, they hired Jim Harbaugh. So he kind of ushered in the Harbaugh era at Michigan.
Yep.
I mean, kind of a hard-nosed, defensive-minded team. And, I mean, he was a great player at Michigan. His sophomore year, he played at all aspects, like I said. He was named Defensive Player of the Year in 2016, and he was a unanimous All-American. And even he was 5th in the Heisman odds, or Heisman voting his junior year, which is crazy for a defensive player. As of recent years, Heisman Trophy has only been an offensive award, really, and most, or even just quarterback as of recent as well. You haven't seen really even a running back recently, but being a defensive player and getting some votes for Heisman is pretty incredible. But he helped lead that defensive. He was kind of the leader on the defensive side of the ball, and that helped him get the 25th overall pick by the Cleveland Browns.
Yeah, I know he really looks up to Charles Woodson, another Michigan Wolverine, and that is actually a big reason he ended up going to Michigan. And he didn't quite fill the shoes that Woodson left at Michigan, but I mean, he did a pretty damn good job at trying to be as good as him. I mean, like you said, he was 5th in Heisman voting, which is really incredible and something I think made him fall in the NFL draft, because he certainly was the best defensive player in college football the year he was coming out. He appeared at 15 different positions in college, and I think that scared away a lot of NFL teams. A lot of NFL teams want to see one player play at one position their entire collegiate career, master that one position so you could go into the NFL focusing on one position, and again mastering that one position, because it's such a great leap from college to the NFL game, as we've discussed. So that did cause him to drop a little bit in the NFL draft.
Yeah, that's a good point, because I mean, even like someone like Isaiah Simmons, he's not playing nearly as many positions as Jabrill Peppers played. So I think Isaiah Simmons was able to get away with that because he was just so good at all those positions as well. But looking at Jabrill Peppers' NFL career, he was drafted by the Browns, like I said, but the Browns really struggled to kind of put him at one consistent position. I mean, they tried to put him at cornerback, free safety, and he just didn't really fit well in them, and he wasn't really that productive with the Cleveland Browns. But obviously, he was traded to the Giants in that Odell trade, and the Giants put him at strong safety, so he's playing kind of more closer to the line. He was able to become, because he did play linebacker, so he was able to kind of use his body more at strong safety. So with the Giants, I think he increased his production a lot with the Giants, and he's kind of become a little bit of a bright spot on that defensive side of the ball.
Yeah, I certainly think we haven't seen the best of Peppers yet in the NFL. I mean, the Giants ended up picking up his 5th-year option, so clearly the Giants do believe in Peppers and think he's going to be a very good player. He did suffer a season-ending injury in Week 11, but I mean, if you watch a lot of Giants games last year, that defense really wasn't good, but I think Peppers really was a standout player on that defensive side of the ball for the Giants. I'm not sure, he hasn't been nearly as good as Jamal Adams, who got drafted before him. And I'm not sure if he's been nearly as good as Malik Hooker either, who also got drafted before him to the Colts. But I mean, I think he's going to end up being a pretty very solid player for the New York Giants, and I think he's going to be a cornerstone for their rebuilding defense.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, he's from Michigan, so I'm not really a fan of him, but hopefully he'll have a good NFL career. So moving on to the number one prospect for the 2014 class, we have kind of the infamous, love him or hate him, Leonard Fournette. So coming out of New Orleans, like a lot of players, he signed with the hometown team, and he signed with LSU. So you want to go into his production in high school?
Yeah, so Leonard Fournette grew up in quite a troubled area, especially after Hurricane Katrina hit in 2005. Obviously, he's from New Orleans, so that really hit right at his home. So he really didn't have much interest in football until Katrina hit. He ended up moving to Houston, which is really a football town. I mean, obviously New Orleans has a football team. Houston does too, but Houston has more of a rich type of high school just place to play football. So he ended up coming back to New Orleans to play high school football. And in high school, not only was he a phenomenal football player, but he was a very good track star. And he, I mean, was an absolute standout freshman running back. He ended up having over 2,500 yards and 30 touchdowns as a freshman in high school on varsity, which is just absolutely unheard of. He ended up becoming the first freshman ever to get a scholarship from LSU for football. So, I mean, very early on in his high school career, he was very, very well documented across the nation to be a future NFL talent. He was first team All-State every single year he played in high school and was Louisiana's Mr. Football in 2013, along with being USA Today's Offensive Player of the Year and an All-American. I mean, he's one of the best prospects to ever come out of Louisiana. And at the Under Armour All-American game, like you said, he ended up committing to the first school that recruited him his freshman year, LSU.
Yeah, so looking at his college stats, important point, he wore number 7 at LSU, which the number 7 is usually given to the best player on LSU's roster. So this past year was given to Grant Delpit, he's a great NFL player. He was picked in the second round of this year's draft. But looking at his freshman year, he rushed over 1,000 yards, which is great for a freshman. And then in 2015, his best year, he finished 6th in the Heisman voting, but he almost had 2,000 yards rushing, which is pretty insane. You had someone like J.K. Dobbins who rushed over 2,000 yards this past year, and he had an exceptional offensive line. So you saw someone like Leonard Fournette, who was the whole offense, because before Joe Burrow and with the Les Miles era at LSU, they were just ground and pound. So he was fed the rock every game, and you just saw the production he was able to have, really. And then his junior year, his last year, he was injured, so he only played 7 games, and he didn't have 1,000 yards, but obviously in 7 games he had over 800 yards, which is still pretty great.
Yeah, I mean, his incredible sophomore year, I mean, he ended up finishing 6th in Heisman voting, and he was first team all SEC. No matter what he did the next year, obviously he was injured, still had a pretty good year, but he was going to be a top 5, top 10 pick just based on his sophomore year. He was the first SEC player in history to rush for 200 or more yards in 3 straight games, and really a memorable moment. I think for me, honestly, the most memorable moment out of Leonard Fournette's LSU career was that game against Alabama. He ended up, I mean, that was a very hyped game just because it was Leonard Fournette against that great Alabama defense. And like you said, with really no threat from the passing game out of LSU at that time. And LSU really isn't known to have a great offensive line either. So he really had the cards stacked against him at Alabama versus Alabama. And it was at Alabama as well. So, I mean, the prospects were he was going to have a tough day, but I don't think anybody expected the day he ended up having. He had 19 carries for 31 yards. And, I mean, he was first in Heisman voting up to that point in polling, and that really ended up making his Heisman favorites plummeting. And that really was a wake-up call for, I think, a lot of college football fans and some NFL teams that in his biggest game of his college career, he really shrank.
Yeah, I mean, definitely even besides like how good you are, I mean, if you're playing against Alabama, it's going to be really hard. But like someone like Fournette, you definitely expect him to show up against Alabama just because how good he is. But also a bright spot in his college career against Ole Miss, he had 250 rushing yards, which was six yards shy of LSU's record. But I remember watching that LSU game, I mean that Ole Miss LSU game on TV, and that just he was just running over people. I remember just he was running and the guy dove for his legs, and he kneeled down just to get that contact because he just craved it so much. So
Yeah.
he's a big body running back and he craves that contact.
Yeah, I mean, he's really an Adrian Peterson-esque runner. At least he really was in college. I mean, a lot of people compared him to Adrian Peterson, and he really looked like Adrian Peterson. But I think a sad part of Leonard Fournette's football career thus far, I mean, you see he's been a standout running back since his freshman year of high school. Like we said, he had 2,500 yards and 30 touchdowns his freshman year in high school. So he's been the focal point of his offense. Even in the NFL, every single year he's been playing football, and he's a player where it's kind of sad because I think he's been run into the ground a little bit
Yeah.
prematurely because, I mean, like I said, he's had so many touches over the past 8 to 10 years. I mean, he has so much tread on his tires even before coming into the NFL. So, I mean, that certainly should have been a red flag for the Jaguars.
Yeah, and then another red flag, I think, his junior year he was injured. So I mean, he was against Florida. He was injured. He wasn't supposed to play that game, but he got into a scuffle as the injured player in the pregame warmups. So it
Yeah.
just shows he's sort of a hothead. And then after the scuffle, Coach O gave him permission to play that game. So he was visibly injured, and he didn't even he put up 40 yards the whole game, but he just kind of his hotheadness, maybe his competitiveness, which is also, I guess, a plus as well. But
Yeah.
tried to play, and he wasn't. He really shouldn't have played that game.
Yeah, another red flag with Leonard Fournette going into the NFL. He ended up at the scouting combine. He showed up 5 pounds over his playing weight, which I mean is pretty confusing, especially from a running back. If you go into the NFL combine, you kind of want to just show off your speed and athleticism and call it a day. But he ended up having a 4.5 140, which isn't terrible for a running back, most certainly, especially a running back of his style. But he ended up getting drafted fourth overall by the Jaguars, which is just incredibly high for a running back. I really am strongly against picking a running back that high, but that's how great Leonard Fournette was at college and at the high school level. And right away into the NFL, he was the focal point of their offense when they went to the AFC Championship and eventually lost versus the Pats. And I mean, since then, he's been pretty injured and slightly inconsistent. And just this past offseason, he's been in the trade rumors all offseason. No teams wanted to trade for him. So the Jaguars just kind of said, we're not going to cut him. We're just going to decline his 5th-year option, which they did. And he's going to be a free agent next year. So it's going to be interesting not only what he does in the 2020 season with the Jags, but where he signs in 2021, because I would imagine that he's not going to be a Jaguar for much longer.
Yeah, I mean, his rookie year he rushed over 1,000 yards, and then last year he rushed over 1,000 yards as well. But I would argue that his rookie year was kind of his best year, even though he did have the most rushing yards this past year. Because
Yeah.
his rookie year is kind of he was their whole offense, and he really ran the offense because obviously they had Blake Bortles at quarterback, and he's not really making any big time throws or big time plays. So the whole offense ran through Fournette, and that's how they were able to get 10 wins. Also, they had their great defense, but against Pittsburgh in that divisional round, he was able to break off a couple big runs and really kind of put a cherry on top of that win. And it's just, I don't know. He is a two-time 1,000-yard rusher, but obviously he has some on-the-field issues. He's obviously argued with Tom Coughlin. He's gotten to many fights in the field on the game during games. One of the biggest one against the Bills when I think it was punched Shaq Lawson in the face.
Yeah.
But it's just kind of a hothead that you saw that in college and it carried over to the NFL.
Yeah, I think with a lot of these top 10 high school senior football recruits from 2014 and from a lot of years especially in the 2010s, we see these players, their best days are kind of behind them, even when they entered the NFL. And I think with Leonard Fournette, I think his football career, I mean, if it didn't peak in his sophomore year at LSU, I think it certainly peaked in his rookie season with the Jaguars.
Yeah. So looking at this top 10, who do you think is the number one? Who do you think is the best out of these 10 players?
I certainly think it is Myles Garrett, and he definitely has the potential. Not only has he shown he is the best player from this draft class, but I think he's shown the potential that he could, going forward, be certainly the best player in this top 10.
Yeah, I completely agree, Myles Garrett. I mean, despite all of his on-the-field issues, he put up the numbers. He's been the leader on that defense. I mean, looking at these people, it's just astonishing to see that there are other players ranked ahead of him. Like we've mentioned multiple times throughout this video that they might have peaked in high school. That's why they were able to get such high rankings. But Myles Garrett, easily the best player out of these top 10. But looking at we're going to go into a little bit of the 300 the 290 other prospects in this list.
Yeah.
This is a pretty incredible draft class.
Really,
recruiting class, really. I mean, if you just scroll down a little bit, at 15 and 16, you have Marlon Humphrey, who is one of the best cornerbacks in the league, one of the leaders on that Ravens defense. And then 16, you have the great Deshaun Watson, who was leading the Texans and led Clemson to a national championship.
Yeah, you also have at 18 Jamal Adams, who is arguably the best safety in the league. At 19, you have Sony Michel, who had a great rookie season with the Patriots. Really hasn't been able to do too much since then. But at 21, we see Dalvin Cook, too, one of the best running backs in the league. Juju Smith-Schuster at 24, very young-looking Juju Smith-Schuster. I mean, you have Solomon Thomas at 25, who is a really integral part of that Super Bowl losing 49ers team. I mean, so even you have Raekwon McMillan, who's been a very good linebacker for the Dolphins at 13. So, I mean, this is just an incredible scouting class, but not the greatest look for ESPN that some of these guys, I mean, even getting into the hundreds, 200s, and so on. I mean, you see some better players than some of the players in the top 10, but I mean, it's very hard to predict some of these outcomes for some of these players. Again, we have Marshawn Lattimore, who is an athlete coming out of Ohio, ended up going to Ohio State. He was the 45th ranked prospect, who I think he's one of the best cornerbacks in the NFL as well.
And at 218, you have Christian McCaffrey, who is in the conversation for best offensive player in the NFL. So,
yep.
I mean, you see someone, Christian McCaffrey, who is an athlete. He's ranked as an athlete, and he's probably just coming out of high school. He was probably such a raw individual that
yep.
There was just no way they can rank him higher on that list. So you saw him probably go to Stanford. He went to Stanford, and he was probably just developed such an insane amount that he's able to become the player he is today.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that he's so lowly ranked on this top 300 because we see with ESPN, they kind of favor name notability, and Christian McCaffrey, obviously his dad was actually a very good NFL player, most notably for the Denver Broncos. So a little bit surprising that he was that far down on the list, considering he was still a pretty good high school player, certainly. The top tight end from this class, I think, is all the way at 104, Dalton Schultz, but he's been a pretty good NFL player as well. So just some really outstanding NFL talent in this top 300. But in that top 10, it was really hit or miss, as we discussed.
Yeah. So we hope you guys enjoyed this little look back at this recruiting class. Let us know if we should do another one in the future and tell us what year. But we really hope you enjoyed this episode. We'll see you in the next one.